Many of us know that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives, have been a part of the makeup of corporate structure for many years now. However, over the past year, we've seen an increased interest in moving these initiatives to the forefront, and that's across various industries, geographic regions, and business sizes. That's driven in some ways by the pandemic and its impact on disenfranchised communities, and driven in other ways by civil unrest in our country and what many have called a racial reckoning. Either way, this increased interest in DEI has led to organizations creating or revamping their DEI initiatives, although a lot of that has taken place while a significant portion of the workforce was working remotely. Well, now that many of us are heading back to the office, or soon will be, it's a great time for organizations to take a deeper look at what our DEI programs should look like and the fundamental components that effective DEI initiatives should have. And that's what we'll be talking about today. We are dividing this discussion into 4 parts. First, what is DEI and why does it matter? Second and third, recruiting and retention, since we tend to think about DEI initiatives in these 2 constructs. And lastly, we'll talk about the impact of the pandemic and how the events of the last year and a half have impacted diverse populations, and how a company can take that into account in shaping its DEI initiatives. Next slide, please. So first, let's start by level setting and making sure that we understand these terms: diversity, equity, and inclusion. So diversity is all the ways in which people differ, or the range of human differences. Years ago, we used to think of diversity as just race and gender, but we know it's much more than that. It's race and ethnicity, gender and gender identity, also sexual orientation, also age, social class, physical ability or attributes, religious or ethical value systems, national origin, political beliefs, and potentially many other categories. But essentially, diversity reflects individuals and groups from a broad spectrum of different demographics and different philosophical ideals. So if diversity is the bringing together of people having different demographics and ideals, then equity is the process of ensuring that a company's operations and programs are impartial and fair, and that they provide equal possible outcomes for every employee, regardless of those different demographics and ideals. And while equity relates to fairness in different processes, inclusion describes the workplace environment and culture. In other words, an inclusive workplace promotes a sense of belonging. It values practices and respect for employees' backgrounds and beliefs, and it protects diversity by valuing individuals and groups and creating an environment that's free from prejudice and where mutual respect is just a part of how the company operates. And this becomes key when we talk about retention, because employees often will not stay where they don't feel included or a part of the team. You may have heard the expression bringing your whole self to work. Well, inclusive workplaces create environments where everyone feels the freedom to do that. So now that we know what DEI means, let's talk about why effective DEI initiatives are important, other than it being the right thing or good thing to do. There are multiple rationales, and I'm going to go in an order that's a little different than what you see on your slide here. First, the business rationale, which is basically that DEI initiatives help companies make more money. That is because diverse workforces are more productive and more creative. And we have statistics that show this to be true. Companies with diverse management teams have 19% higher revenues. 85% of CEOs say that having a diverse workforce improve their bottom lines. And with regard to recruitment, 67% of job seekers say that diversity is an important factor when considering a company. Next, leadership rationale is that leaders who are culturally sensitive tend to have communication skills, interpersonal skills, and social networks that lead to them attaining high levels of position, not just within their industries, but outside of their industries as well. The democracy rationale is the idea that a diverse workforce that reflects the communities that it serves is better positioned to foster trust in that company as a service provider to that community. And relatedly, the demographic rationale is that as our communities become more diverse, so should the industries that service them mirror the communities that they represent. And we know that based on the 2016 and 2020 census data, projections are that by 2050, more than half of the US population will be from visible minority communities. Now, the last rationale, the risk management rationale, is probably what resonates the most with those of us who are concerned with legal exposure. This rationale is that effective DEI initiatives help organizations reduce potential liability exposure and litigation expense, meaning that equitable and inclusive workplace cultures discourage harassment and discrimination by helping to ensure that salary and other employment decisions are based on business factors rather than on those demographic factors that we talked about. Now, as a result, these diverse and equitable workplace cultures decrease the likelihood of discrimination complaints and litigation. Now, that being said, of course, even the best DEI program cannot guarantee 100% elimination of discrimination complaints. Nevertheless, workplaces that actively promote equity and inclusivity are more likely to have processes in place that reduce the kinds of biases in employment decisions that often lead to discrimination complaints and lawsuits. And let's talk about a couple of examples of what that might look like. Now, imagine you are a working parent in 2020, and because of the pandemic, you're forced to work from home alongside, let's say, your 4-year-old child. You're in a virtual meeting on camera, and somehow your 4-year-old enters the room and does what 4-year-olds tend to do, which is make their presence known clearly and loudly. Now, rather than laughing it off or showing some grace and patience, your boss on the other end of this virtual meeting says, "Hey, you really need to take care of your kid's situation." Now, this happens multiple times until several weeks later, you're terminated. Or imagine that before your termination, you ask your employer to adjust your work schedule so that you can better take care of your child who's home from school. And not only does your boss tell you no, but they tell you that if you try to take leave under the FFCRA, or the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, they will demote you or terminate you. Well, that doesn't sound like an inclusive workplace environment, right? Well, those are the allegations of 2 cases, Delaney versus Advantage Sales and Wallace versus Hub International Insurance Services. Both cases were filed last year in Pennsylvania and California, respectively. Now, whether the allegations are true and whether they constitute violations of anti-discrimination laws still remains to be proven in court. But these are still 2 examples of how adverse employment action was allegedly threatened or actually carried out based on non-performance or non-merit related reasons. These types of circumstances are less likely to happen in a workplace that, 1, has processes in place to guard against biases and discrimination in employment decisions, and 2, has a workplace culture that promotes inclusivity and belonging, even for working parents. And we'll talk later about strategies for working parent support. Next slide, please. If the threat of litigation isn't enough, we have a recent example of successful litigation in favor of a plaintiff with the Diaz versus Tesla verdict handed down on October 4th this year, so just a few weeks ago. This was a federal jury in San Francisco that ordered Tesla to pay nearly $137 million to a former worker because of racist treatment. The plaintiff was a Black elevator operator who accused Tesla of ignoring racial abuse that he faced while working at the company's factory. Some of the allegations included the N-word and other racial slurs being used repeatedly, swastikas and other derogatory images being painted on bathroom stalls. So this was a hostile environment, and legally speaking and generally speaking, a non-inclusive workplace culture. Now, what's notable here is, 1, that this was a federal jury, not a state, despite the fact that we tend to think of federal law and federal juries as slightly more favorable to defendants. Number two, the plaintiff here was a subcontractor, not a Tesla employee. The jury rejected Tesla's argument that staffing agencies that it contracted with were responsible for training the subcontractors on harassment policies. Instead, the jury found that Tesla was responsible for investigating and eliminating the discriminatory treatment once it was brought to their attention, and they failed to do so. The jury found that Tesla was the plaintiff's joint employer with the subcontractor, that Tesla failed to take reasonable steps necessary to prevent the harassment, and that the plaintiff was harmed as a result of Tesla's negligence. Now, this is, of course, one of the more extreme examples that we have, since the discrimination here was so blatant and overt. But the point remains that more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces are better equipped to prevent this kind of behavior from occurring in the first place, or at least effectively addressing it when it comes to light, and avoid high cost dollar exposure and very bad publicity for the company. Next slide. And I'm going to turn this over now to Steve to talk about anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Angela. So really, effective DEI programming starts with establishing an equal employment opportunity policy that reflects the current state of the law, and then obviously complying with that policy. So just some notes on some applicable laws that prohibit discrimination. We're all familiar with Title VII, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and pregnancy. Also, sexual orientation and gender identity. There's the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which prohibits discrimination based on being age 40 or over. There are also jurisdictions, states that have passed laws that prohibit reverse age discrimination. So prohibiting discrimination on being 40 or over, or 40 and under. Additionally, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities and requires reasonable accommodations, as Alex and Antoinette discussed in their last presentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. There's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which protects men and women who perform substantially equal work in the same establishment from sex-based wage discrimination. There's GINA, Title II of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, which prohibits employment discrimination based on genetic information about an applicant, employee, or former employee. And then there's also state and local laws, which may add other protected classifications. For example, in my home state of Minnesota, membership on a local commission is a protected classification. So lots of room for variation there as well. So, these laws also generally prohibit retaliation. And given this, extensive patchwork of law at the federal, state, and sometimes local level, it might beg the question of why is why is an effective DEI initiative really important or necessary? And the answer to that's really twofold. First of all, effective DEI programming supports an equal employment opportunity policy and helps ensure that employers comply with that. And second of all, DEI goes beyond legally protected classes and creates and promotes a workplace that's inclusive and welcoming for all. All right, next slide, please. So we want to talk a little bit about recruiting, and diversity recruiting is the practice of hiring candidates using a process that's free from any kind of bias for or against an individual or group of individuals. It's still merit-based recruiting, still aims to find the best possible candidate, but it's structured to give all applicants, regardless of background, an equal opportunity. And it's important to be strategic about recruiting, particularly because there are more job openings than people looking for work, and companies are facing the tightest labor market that they have in really 50 years. So when recruiting, There's some things we want to do to avoid running afoul of the laws. We want to avoid questions relating to classes that are protected by discrimination laws. And there's lots of different questions that should be avoided. Questions relating to whether the candidate has or intends to have children, marital status, race, religion, sexual orientation, age, disability, citizenship, or drug or alcohol use. Sometimes even seemingly benign and broad questions can be viewed by candidates or others as problematic because they may elicit the type of information that otherwise you shouldn't be asking about. For example, what do you do in your free time? May be viewed as eliciting information relating to whether the candidate has children or their marital status. So something to keep in mind. You want to stray away from questions that seek to elicit that kind of information. This also applies with regard to job postings and applications. You want to be careful with the way that your job postings are worded. For example, a job posting that seeks, young applicants or applicants with, just a year or two in the field, or advertisements containing references such as energetic or fresh-faced, may be viewed as, symptomatic of age discrimination. Comparably, advertisements that contain gendered and gendered terminology like busboy or waitress or stewardess may be viewed as running afoul of gender discrimination laws. Advertisements seeking able-bodied applicants or saying that the applicant must be in good health may be problematic from a disability law perspective. Same thing with advertisements seeking American-born or English-speaking candidates that may be problematic from a national origin perspective. And another thing that is also something that you should generally stray away from in terms of posting, for jobs is basically saying that clean records only or criminal records, need not apply, felons need not apply. That has the potential to run afoul of a lot of, workplace opportunity laws that are popping up, relatively quickly in a lot of jurisdictions throughout the company. For example, New York City just passed one this past July. Okay, if we could go to the next slide, please. So another thing about recruiting that I should just really briefly mention with regard to the ADA is that the Americans with Disabilities Act does require reasonable accommodations in the recruiting process. So if an applicant has, an issue with regard to sight or dexterity or hearing or what have you, there, is an obligation to provide an accommodation in that context to really work with that applicant to make sure that they are able to get a fair interview process and they're able to complete that as successfully as possible. With regard to recruiting, there's some common biases in the interview process that we should be aware of and that we should really seek to temper. One is the confirmation bias, and that's seeking information to support the interviewer's initial assumption about a candidate. This is a surprising statistic, but 60% of interviewers will make a decision about a candidate within the first 15 minutes of meeting them, and some will have done it before the interview even happens. If the questions being asked are irrelevant and trying to elicit answers that solely seek to support an initial assumption about that candidate, there's an obvious danger that we could be passing over great candidates for really no good reason at all. Another bias in the interview process to avoid is affect heuristics, which is judging a candidate's suitability for a position based on irrelevant and superficial factors. Quite simply, if you are judging somebody's suitability for a position on the basis of noticeable tattoos or weight, obviously you're overlooking, other attributes that might make that person a really great candidate for the job. So another bias to avoid in the interview process. Similarly, the halo effect should be avoided. That's relying too heavily on one particular positive aspect of the candidate to the, essentially to the exclusion of other information regarding that candidate. For example, where the person went to school. That should be avoided. You really want to take into account the candidate as a whole, not focus too heavily on one particular aspect. And the similarity attraction bias is hiring candidates who are like us or have similar traits. Obviously, if those don't correlate to job performance, they shouldn't necessarily be a part of the calculus. So another thing to avoid in the hiring process. If we could go to the next slide, please, Mary. Some tips for recruiting is that requiring implicit bias training for recruiters, interviewers, and other hiring personnel can help weed out the detrimental effects of those particular biases. So that's recommended. Resume only decisions should be avoided to the extent possible so that employers can get, kind of a more holistic view of a candidate. You should utilize a candidate evaluation form that helps generate analytics so that you can, kind of compare candidates more broadly using those same kinds of analytics. Utilizing group deliberation and decision making too is always a good thing. Generally more heads are better than one when it comes down to hiring decisions. And re-examining your outward facing branding. You want to be careful about the way that the company is portrayed when it comes to the website, brand messaging, pictures on Glassdoor, what have you. Think about what kind of an impression you're making on potential candidates. When actively sourcing, you should think about the messaging that's being placed on job boards. You certainly want to include a statement that indicates that you're an equal opportunity employer. And you also might want to think about where you're posting for positions. For example, Greenhouse senior recruiter Ariana Moon has said that we need to diversify where we're posting job listings. We saw a huge impact on our pipeline once we began listing jobs on diversity recruiting websites. So think about your outward facing messaging as well. Regardless, at every point during the interview process, the candidate should feel that they're applying for a position and for an employer where they can really thrive, and should feel that they're being respected and treated well throughout the process. Next slide, please. And with this, I'll hand it over to Angela.
Thanks, Steve. And before I talk about retention, I just want to answer a question that was posted in the Q&A. What if a job posting describes a top tier school candidate? Is there any concern from a DEI perspective? And Steve touched on this a little bit in talking about whether or not to mention or ask in an interview what school a candidate attended. As far as seeking top tier school candidates, that type of policy or requirement may not be discriminatory on its face, but you want to think about the potential discriminatory impact because certain schools tend to have very low diverse populations. And you also want to think about how does that play out in the interview and the candidate selection process. You want to think about being a little bit more specific in the criteria that you're looking for and the reasons why you're seeking a top tier school candidate. Perhaps those reasons can be accomplished, or those objectives can be accomplished in another way. So moving on to retention, now that our effective recruiting efforts were successful and got our diverse employees in the door, how do companies get them to stay? This starts with the onboarding process. And the results of a recent HR survey are really quite telling. The survey reports that 31% of people have left a job within the first 6 months, with 68% reporting that they may have departed or have departed a job within the first 3 months. So how an employee is engrafted into a company matters a great deal. And when we talk about onboarding, we're specifically talking about training, opportunities, and introductions. With training, it's how new employees are receive instruction over and above the base level qualifications and requirements for the job. Are they provided with adequate instruction for how to perform in order to meet the organization's expectations? With regard to opportunities, what's the basis for decisions about what opportunities and assignments are offered to employees, especially for high profile opportunities that will advance their position within the company? And with regard to introductions, to what extent are new employees introduced to key persons within the organization that have decision-making authority regarding their advancement? New employees will take stock of these factors very quickly, and within the first 3 to 6 months of starting at a company, will use these factors to make a decision about whether to leave or to stay. And what we want you to think about here are those implicit biases that Steve mentioned, which might impact onboarding decisions. Unconscious biases not only have significant impact on feelings of inclusiveness, but they can also potentially create institutional barriers to growth over time. So it's important that the employees start off on the right foot as soon as that they are hired. Next slide, please. So beyond the onboarding process, here are a few more factors to consider with regard to retention. We've already addressed the unconscious biases, supporting the creation of resource groups. And this includes minority, women, LGBTQ, or others. Resource groups create opportunities for diverse employees to interact with one another and create a support system for members of the group to flourish and learn from one another. Promoting mentor and sponsor relationships. We want to distinguish between these two things. Mentors are actively engaged with the employee and helping their growth and development over time. Sponsors are actively engaged with advocating for the employee with key persons in the organization and connecting the employee to key persons. Both mentors and sponsors are essential to all employees' growth and development. So the key here is to ensure that diverse employees have the same access to those relationships as everyone else. Make the path to growth transparent. Make sure that everyone knows what opportunities are available and what competencies are needed to get to the next level. Additionally, you want to assess whether there are unwritten rules of advancement within the company. Diverse employees who are excluded, whether intentionally or unconsciously, from certain social networks within a company are most often the employees who will be unaware of those unwritten rules. Courageous conversations. So when conversations or actions negatively impact someone or a group of people, that behavior should be identified and called out as soon as possible, whether in a subtle way or overtly. One example might be if a team member's contribution is dismissed or overlooked, and then someone in the dominant group restates the same idea and takes credit for it. This is a great opportunity for someone to say, to remind the group where the idea originated. And this is true also if a statement is made that's potentially offensive toward a particular person or group. If the conduct in question rises to the level of a possible discrimination or harassment report, that should be investigated. And we'll talk in a moment about what that investigation should look like. With regard to managers, you want to make sure that they're trained on how to lead diverse teams, specifically how their behavior impacts their team members' sense of belonging and by way of example, teaches their team members what behavior is and is not acceptable. Managers should also be encouraged to continuously assess their processes to ensure that everyone on the team gets the same opportunities. And that should be based on objective as criteria as possible. Another way to motivate managers to become more inclusive is by rewarding them for retaining new talent on their teams. And obviously those rewards can take many different forms. And it's great to be creative about what that might look like. Stay interviews, I think, are really an underutilized resource, and research shows that it can be one of the most effective diversity retention tools. This is a proactive way to make sure that your diverse talent understands and appreciates their value in the company before they even begin to think about transitioning. And so it's important to identify who those possible transitioners might be and have those conversations sooner rather than later. Next slide. So in a perfectly diverse and equitable and inclusive world, all of the tools that we've just discussed would be implemented and there would never be a complaint or allegation of discrimination. And we know that that perfect world doesn't exist. There is always the potential for a complaint or report of discrimination or harassment. What matters, however, is how those reports and complaints are handled and that they are investigated effectively and thoroughly, because the handling of the complaint can really make a difference in building trust with the reporting employee. So the first thing that you want to do is establish a clearly defined reporting process. This should answer the question of what kind of conduct constitutes discrimination or conduct that violates the company's EEO policy, and the question of who should receive reports of possible discrimination. All of this should be clearly stated in the company's employee handbook or manual, a copy of that provided to all employees at the point of onboarding, and the policy should be continuously reviewed and revised to reflect changes and updates in the law and in the company's own processes. You also want to conduct a thorough internal investigation or retain outside counsel. Now, whether or not to conduct the investigation internally or retain counsel is, of course, a case-by-case decision that counsel can also help make the determination. There's always the potential for litigation, and so involving counsel can help protect privilege over certain communications and documents related to the investigation. Retaining counsel can also help reinforce that the company is taking the complaint seriously and is taking an objective look at the allegations, especially if the complaint involves allegations of egregious conduct or a high-level employee. And whether the investigation is conducted internally or by counsel, there are certain boxes you want to check, including interviewing key persons, not just thoroughly and efficiently, but also in a way that fosters trust in the process and encourages the complainant and witnesses to be forthcoming and honest with the investigator. You want to collect as many documents as possible and make sure that they are preserved in a way that makes them accessible should more complaints arise later on. And there are a few lessons we learned here from the recent Tesla verdict. The plaintiff's allegations were not just that the discriminatory conduct occurred, but also that once it was reported, the company failed to thoroughly conduct an investigation. And so you want to make sure that, again, despite complaints arising, that you investigate them as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. I know we're at time here. Should we go on to the next section, which is our last section, and quickly wrap up?
Sure.
Sure. So I'll talk just very briefly about the pandemic impact. It's obviously affected how everybody sees the world and how employees are seeing their job places as well, or the workplaces. Can we go to the next slide, please? So there has been, I'll just summarize this. Generally speaking, members of diverse populations have reported additional challenges and felt them more acutely than non-diverse counterparts over the course of the pandemic. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is manifested itself, in substantial loss of, numbers of women from the workforce, actually, over the course of our recent history. 275,000 women left the workforce in January of this year. And other studies show that more than 2 million left the labor force in 2020. And that's partly attributable to a disproportionate number of basically, or partially attributable to the pressure and stress of working from home, while children are also attending school from home. If we could go to the next slide, please. So some considerations to think about to help alleviate these issues, is potential relaxed work schedule, more flexible hours, resource and support groups for everybody, creating spaces that are, good for sharing and for listening, over communicating with employees with regard to plans, educating them. 50% of people don't know what meaningful action is being taken by their employers to increase inclusivity. So really driving that home with employees is important. And then also normalizing the new normal with regard to children or pets in the home workspace when remote work is, the venue for a particular employee. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Angela.
Thanks, Steve. And just the last section here, we just wanted to acknowledge and discuss how the racial reckoning, so-called racial reckoning that the country has experienced over the past year has as a part of what has motivated companies to revisit their DEI policies and programs. And we wanted to just offer a few suggestions on how to effectively put that into acknowledgement and incorporate it into your DEI initiatives. And we can go to the next slide and the next one. And so there are just several statistics that that support the contention of how these ideas and issues have impacted companies in a way, by way of interviews, quotes, and the like. And we just want to offer a few words of instruction, and you can go to the next slide. So many companies have taken this opportunity to release public statements, put things on their website to voice support for racial equity, and that's great. But words and platitudes are simply not enough. You want to make sure that you take action and implement a lot of the policies and protocols that we've talked about. You want to ensure that ideas are implemented and maintain consistency over time. That means revisiting them to make sure that they are achieving the measures that you sought out for them to achieve, and continue prioritization and expanded budgets for DEI more broadly, just to, again, reinforce your company's commitment to improve DEI, which may come by way of, if you don't already have it in place, creating and maintaining a DEI committee or a chief diversity officer. In other words, creating committees or leaders who are specifically assigned to taking authority and ownership of these initiatives and ensuring that they are carried out effectively over time for the entire workforce. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.